At the very beginning of this 6-week series, we talked about Sabbath as remembering. Remembering who we were created to be. And then week by week, we examined more ways in which we could practice Sabbath in our lives, in relationships, through renewal, by refocusing, by being part of restoration. Today, our study of Sabbath brings us back to the first story where we began, the story of creation, remembering who we were created to be, wholeness, purpose, relationship, healing, all that we long for in our lives and in our communities and in our country and in the world. Today we examine Sabbath as radical witness, because if Sabbath truly means coming back to who we were meant to be, it also means that whatever change we want to see in ourselves and in the world begins with us. The song was sort of written as an afterthought one day in a recording studio by blues legend Otis Redding. The recording was mildly successful within the blues community, but it wasn't until 2 years later that the song really took off. In fact, you and I probably wouldn't even recognize or know that the song Respect was written and performed by Otis Redding, because the version we immediately think of is the one recorded by Aretha, 1967. Aretha Franklin heard about Otis Redding's song through the grapevine and decided it expressed her very deep frustrations about being a woman in the 1960s. So she took it to the recording studio and changed up a lot of the lyrics as she went. As we all know, the song became an all-time classic, a call of the feminist movement in the 1960s. Give us a little respect, just a little bit. I imagine if Jesus' disciples had to pick a theme song for the 6th chapter in the Gospel of Mark, well, respect might be the one they asked to have playing on the loudspeakers as they walked back into Nazareth, Jesus' hometown. They were riding the wave of popularity that Jesus had stirred up by going around healing people. The paralytic, the demon-possessed man, the woman with the issue of blood, Jairus' daughter. It seems that Jesus was on a roll. And for the disciples, this meant that their decision to leave everything and follow him was finally paying off. They could now go home to their families with their heads held high, ready to be complimented for that shrewd career move. And finally, they get a little respect. Just give us what you know we deserve. You know it's about time. We deserve a little respect. With the news of Jesus' preaching and miracles traveling fast, the disciples probably didn't think it was unreasonable to assume when they arrived at their next destination, Jesus' hometown of Nazareth, there'd be at least a ticker tape parade. Hometown boy makes good, coming back to show relatives and friends what he's achieved, followed by his trusty disciples, the men who signed up to follow him when no one else thought he was worth anything. Make way for the celebrities. That wasn't just Joseph and Mary's kid. That was someone who commanded a little bit of respect. And so when they got to the town, they went straight to the synagogue, and Jesus began to teach. Many who saw him were astounded, the text reads. I imagine that the disciples were about to jump up and bask in all of that reflected glory. But it quickly became apparent that it wasn't respect Jesus was getting. It was more like derision. Is this Joseph, the carpenter's son? You've got to be kidding. Who does he think he is, prancing around in front of everyone? We knew him before he was somebody. We know his whole family. And while Jesus certainly knew that his message wouldn't be popular, the text says that even he marveled at their disbelief. And he pointed out to his disciples, a prophet gets no honor in his hometown. There's no respect here for someone who dares to speak words of truth and challenge. What did you expect, disciples? Well, they expected a community that would welcome them with warm pride and open arms, first on the bandwagon, pressed up close to the front lines, cheering loudest of all for the world-changing message Jesus was preaching. But going home and being met with a less than positive reception taught them very quickly that you do not become a follower of Jesus Christ because you're looking for public acclaim. It was an experiential object lesson, perhaps, to serve as backdrop for the instruction Jesus would give the disciples next. They had to learn that a prophet, a truth teller, never gets the respect she deserves until after she's gone. Why? Because the prophet's words, if they're words from God, are often hard to hear. None of this give the masses what they want and lull them into complacency and in the process ensure mass popularity, which I think is what the disciples had imagined. The gospel Jesus was proclaiming and that the disciples would preach to as soon as they caught on was a gospel full of hard things. Teachings like welcoming the stranger and loving people who are unlovable and living your life as if you really believe that the kingdom of God is coming to be on this earth. And proclaimers of that message, well, they wouldn't get all that much respect, even in their hometown, maybe especially in their hometown. Jesus gave the disciples instructions next, sent them out. He told them not to take anything with them except the clothes they wore on their backs and the message they had to proclaim. Go boldly into new places, Jesus told them, even into old places where people knew you before. And tell them what I've taught you about making peace with God and learning to live a new life. Be radical witnesses. The disciples wanted their theme song to go something like Aretha Franklin's version of Respect, but if they were listening closely to Jesus, they would have known that some kind of medley of Hit the Road, Jack, and Ain't Too Proud to Beg might have been more appropriate. Jesus wanted them to know that the life of faith is not a life of instant acclaim, automatic comfort, or even respect. He wanted them to know that they would hit the dusty roads of Palestine and they wouldn't always be welcomed with open arms. The gospel message they were called to radically witness was a hard message to preach, and it's a hard message to hear, even at home. Jesus knew what his disciples didn't know yet, that at the end of their road lay not political power or hometown hero status, but a cross. And Jesus knew that those disciples were going to have to decide then, and then again, and again and again, if being a radical witness to a message of love and reconciliation was worth the price. And what makes us think that it would be any different for us? If the practice of Sabbath, remembering who we are created to be, brings us back to a message of love, God's expansive and all-encompassing love for us and for the whole world, then the same question is facing us too. Will we, you and me, use our lives to be radical witnesses? While most of America was grilling hot dogs and watching fireworks on Wednesday, I went to church. And by church, I mean a brand new 20-screen AMC theater complex. Come to think of it, the church might take some tips from the rows of gleaming soda machines, the expansive lobby, and they had self-serve popcorn. I know I'm making the ushers really nervous right now. Sorry about that. I went to the theater to see a documentary film about Fred Rogers. Mr. Rogers To those of us who were television watching children in the 1970s, the film is called Won't You Be My Neighbor? I went to see it because I had a childhood shaped by Mr. Rogers' daily ritual of taking off his coat, putting on a colorful sweater, putting on his sneakers, taking us into his very spare television set, using these slightly scary-looking homemade puppets in the land of make-believe, and talking in a very calm voice about how important we are to the world and to each other. Fred Rogers is a pretty unusual guy who had a passion for talking to children as if they mattered. A truly strange career choice for a young, ordained Presbyterian minister in the 1960s. And to the world, Mr. Rogers was often a joke. Did you see the Eddie Murphy sketch about Mr. Rogers? He appeared almost Pollyannish in his approach to repeating this message of friendship and kindness, as if something so simple could really have any impact in a world filled with such division, separation, pain. His family, friends, and colleagues insist that the Mr. Rogers we saw on television was the Mr. Rogers of real life. Someone who was unfailingly kind, who validated the feelings of even the least significant person in the room, and who wasn't afraid to talk about hard and painful things in the world. And Mr. Rogers, he got mad sometimes. He was resolute in his insistence on love and kindness, not in a way that made him weak, but in a way that displayed the ultimate power of love to change people's hearts and to change the world. He was often outspoken in his disapproval about how writers and producers use the medium of television to depict situations of discord or rancor or conflict, teaching children values of competition, individualism, and greed instead of kindness and acceptance. In his own very eccentric way, he used the flimsy set of his show as a powerful pulpit to combat hatred, violence, racism, pervasive themes going through American culture then and now that were teaching a whole generation of young Americans to be suspicious of people who are different than they were, to hoard their possessions at the expense of others, to live lives that were valued by individual position and prestige with no thought to the well-being of a neighbor. Mr. Rogers wanted to offer an alternative approach to American exceptionalism that called not for independence, but for interdependence, not for shame, but for acceptance and affirmation, and not for violence, but for powerful, life-changing, world-changing kindness, offering every person the invitation, won't you be my neighbor? At the very end of the movie, when the documentary was discussing Mr. Rogers' death, I had the thought, great, Mr. Rogers is dead. No wonder the world is going to hell. But I guess the filmmakers knew we'd all be thinking the same thing, and they were not about to let us walk out of the theater that day without taking the example of Fred Rogers with us. The film closed with every person who had been interviewed for the film asked to sit for a minute in silence and to think for one whole minute. Who is it in your life that has been someone who encouraged you to be kind and neighborly and good? The cast, each one of them in separate video clips, sat and thought, and tears ran down their faces, and mine too. And maybe yours if you take a few moments of silence after the sermon to think about your own life, because there are, in fact, many people in this world who invite you and me to be their neighbor. Many people who choose to be kind, many people who remember that we were created to be whole, and who choose to live their lives as radical witnesses to that possibility. That film was a great reminder. We might not get the respect of our hometowns, but every single one of us can use our lives to make the world better. In this world that tells each of us we can't be valuable unless we look a certain way, own enough stuff, have the right achievements on our resumes, perhaps maybe the most important, impactful, and radical thing that you and I could do is to practice Sabbath, to remember who we were created to be, and to offer our lives to the world with that possibility. I think you'll notice a page in your bulletin that reads, "My radical witness is." In the next few moments of silence, think about how you might answer that question and write something down. It could be anything. It could be giving money, saying a prayer, showing kindness to another person. However it is that you are using your life to remember that we were created to be radical witnesses. And then, if you have a cell phone with you, take a selfie of your radical witness and send it on in. Sorry, ushers, sorry. If you prefer, there'll be staff in the narthex and coffee hour to take your picture holding up your radical witness, and then we will post them on social media so the world will know. We take Jesus' call to be radical witnesses of love and hospitality so seriously. We take the call to radical witness so seriously that every single one of us is going to use our lives to do something. Jesus knew, and we know too, if you live your life being a radical witness, you might not get your hometown to give you the respect you think you deserve, but you might get the world to sit up, take notice, and stop in the name of love. Amen.